Baby Velociraptor stuck in a mud trap. Then T-Rex does something incredible. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The forest floor was a maze of shadows, the dense canopy above blocking most of the sunlight. Twisted roots and thick mud covered the ground, creating a treacherous landscape where every step was a gamble. The sounds of the jungle were constant, a symphony of distant roars, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a branch. In the middle of this chaotic wilderness, a tiny figure struggled. The baby Velociraptor was no more than a few weeks old, its small body covered in soft, greenish scales that blended almost perfectly with the surrounding foliage. Its bright yellow eyes were wide with fear as it thrashed against the mud, its tiny claws scraping futilely at the slippery ground. The mud trap had been hidden beneath a thin layer of leaves, a natural pit created by the heavy rains that had soaked the forest for days. The baby had stepped into it without realizing, its small frame sinking almost instantly into the thick, sticky muck. Now it was trapped. The baby let out a series of high-pitched chirps, its small head darting back and forth as it called for help. The sound was sharp and plaintive, echoing through the trees like a desperate plea. But no help came. The baby's pack was long gone, their sleek, agile bodies disappearing into the underbrush hours earlier. Velociraptors were swift and intelligent, but they were also ruthless. The pack had no room for weakness, no patience for those who couldn't keep up. The baby was alone. It thrashed harder, its small legs kicking against the mud as though sheer willpower could free it. But the more it struggled, the deeper it sank, the mud swallowing its tiny body inch by inch. The jungle around it seemed indifferent, the towering trees and creeping vines offering no solace. Even the sounds of the forest seemed distant now, muffled by the oppressive weight of the mud. The baby chirped again, its voice breaking with exhaustion. It was small and weak, but it wasn't ready to give up. Somewhere deep in its instincts, a fire burned, a primal urge to survive, to fight against the odds no matter how impossible they seemed. But as the minutes stretched into hours, that fire began to wane. The baby's movements grew slower, its chirps quieter as exhaustion took hold. Its tiny body trembled with the effort of staying upright, its bright yellow eyes drooping as though sleep were the only escape from its suffering. And then the ground began to shake. The vibrations were faint at first, a distant tremor that rippled through the mud and rattled the leaves. The baby lifted its head weakly, its eyes flicking toward the treeline. It didn't know what the sound meant, but instinct told it to be afraid. The tremors grew stronger, each one accompanied by a deep, rhythmic thud that echoed through the forest. The baby let out a faint chirp, its body trembling as the vibrations grew closer, louder. And then, through the dense foliage, a massive shadow appeared. The T-Rex towered over the jungle, its massive frame cutting through the trees like a force of nature. Its skin was a dark, mottled brown, covered in scars and ridges that spoke of countless battles. Its eyes glinted like molten gold, scanning the forest with a predatory intensity that made every creature in its path freeze in terror. The baby's breath caught in its chest, its tiny body trembling as the T-Rex stepped into the clearing. The ground shook with each step, the massive dinosaur's claws sinking into the mud as though it were nothing. The T-Rex paused, its head tilting as it sniffed the air. Its nostrils flared, catching the faint scent of the baby Velociraptor trapped in the mud. Slowly, its massive head turned, its golden eyes locking onto the tiny figure struggling in the muck. The baby froze, its chirps falling silent as it stared up at the towering predator. It didn't move, didn't breathe. Every instinct in its small body screamed at it to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The T-Rex took a step closer, its massive foot sinking into the mud with a wet squelch. Its head lowered slightly, its golden eyes narrowing as it studied the tiny creature before it. For a long moment, the jungle was silent. The T-Rex let out a low rumble, its breath hot and heavy as it exhaled. The sound vibrated through the air, deep and guttural, like a warning. The baby whimpered softly, its small body trembling as the predator loomed over it. But then, something unexpected happened. The T-Rex didn't attack. It didn't roar or lunge or bare its massive teeth. Instead, it hesitated. The massive predator tilted its head, its golden eyes softening ever so slightly as it stared down at the baby. There was no malice in its gaze, no hunger, only curiosity. The baby chirped weakly, its small voice breaking the silence. The sound was faint and pitiful, but it carried something that even the T-Rex seemed to understand: fear. The T-Rex let out another low rumble, softer this time, as though responding to the baby's cry. It stepped closer, its massive frame casting a shadow over the mud trap as it leaned down. The baby flinched, its tiny body pressing against the mud as though trying to disappear. But the T-Rex didn't strike. Instead, it lowered its massive snout, sniffing at the baby with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature of its size. The baby's yellow eyes widened, its breath hitching as the predator's warm breath washed over it. It didn't understand what was happening, didn't know why the T-Rex hadn't killed it. And then, the T-Rex did something even more surprising. It moved its massive foot, carefully pressing it against the edge of the mud trap. The baby chirped in alarm, its tiny claws scraping at the muck as it tried to move. But the T-Rex didn't stop. With slow, deliberate movements, the predator began to dig. The T-Rex's claws sank into the mud, scooping away the thick muck that held the baby captive. It worked carefully, its movements surprisingly precise for such a massive creature. The baby watched in stunned silence, its tiny body trembling as the T-Rex continued to dig. It didn't understand why the predator was helping it, didn't know what to make of the strange, gentle movements. The T-Rex let out another low rumble, glancing down at the baby as though to reassure it. Its golden eyes were calm, almost kind, as it worked to free the tiny creature. Slowly, the mud began to loosen. The baby's small legs twitched as it felt the weight of the muck around it lessen. It chirped softly, its voice filled with a cautious hope that it hadn't felt in hours. The T-Rex paused, its massive head tilting as it studied the baby. It let out a soft huff, its breath ruffling the baby's scales as though urging it to move. The baby hesitated, its yellow eyes flicking between the predator and the mud around it. Then, with a burst of effort, it kicked its tiny legs, pushing against the loosened muck. Slowly, inch by inch, the baby began to rise. The T-Rex stepped back, its massive frame looming over the clearing as it watched the baby struggle. Its golden eyes glinted in the dappled sunlight, a flicker of something unspoken passing through them. Finally, with one last push, the baby broke free. It collapsed onto the ground, its tiny body trembling with exhaustion. The mud clung to its scales, thick and heavy, but it was free. The baby lifted its head, its yellow eyes locking onto the T-Rex. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the T-Rex lowered its massive head, letting out a soft, rumbling sound. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was something else entirely, something almost gentle. The baby chirped softly, its tiny voice trembling as it stared up at the predator. It didn't understand what had just happened, didn't know why the T-Rex had saved it. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The jungle around them was quiet, the sounds of distant roars and rustling leaves fading into the background. For the first time in hours, the baby felt safe. And for the first time in its life, the T-Rex felt something it couldn't quite explain. The baby Velociraptor lay on the ground, its tiny chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. The mud clung to its scales, forming thick patches that made it difficult to move. It tilted its head, its yellow eyes flicking back up to the towering T-Rex above it. The T-Rex stood still, its massive frame casting a long shadow over the clearing. Its golden eyes were calm, observing the tiny creature with a curiosity that felt oddly out of place for a predator of its size. It let out another soft rumble, its breath warm as it exhaled. The baby chirped faintly, its voice trembling as it took a cautious step backward. Its small legs wobbled beneath its weight, the exhaustion from hours of struggling against the mud making every movement feel impossible. The T-Rex didn't move. It simply watched, its head tilting slightly as though trying to understand the baby's behavior. The baby froze, its tiny body trembling as it stared up at the predator. Fear was still etched into its instincts, telling it to run, to flee, but its body wouldn't listen. And, more confusingly, the T-Rex wasn't attacking. The baby chirped again, softer this time, as though testing the waters. The T-Rex responded with another low rumble, its massive head lowering slightly. The sound wasn't threatening. It was almost soothing, like the growl of a parent reassuring its offspring. The baby blinked, its yellow eyes wide with confusion. It didn't understand what was happening, didn't know why the predator was acting this way. The T-Rex took a step back, its massive foot sinking into the mud with a faint squelch. Its golden eyes flicked toward the tree-line, scanning the dense forest as though searching for something. The baby watched, its tiny head tilting as it followed the T-Rex's gaze. The jungle was alive with sound, distant roars, the rustle of leaves, the faint buzz of insects. But the clearing felt strangely quiet, as though the world had paused for this moment. The T-Rex turned back toward the baby, letting out another soft huff. It lowered its head again, nudging the baby gently with the tip of its massive snout. The baby let out a startled chirp, stumbling slightly as the T-Rex's touch pushed it forward. It scrambled to regain its footing, its tiny claws scraping against the ground. The T-Rex rumbled softly, its golden eyes narrowing slightly as it watched the baby. It wanted the baby to move. The baby hesitated, its yellow eyes flicking between the T-Rex and the dense forest beyond the clearing. It didn't understand why, but the predator's presence didn't feel threatening. If anything, it felt protective. Slowly, cautiously, the baby took a step forward. The T-Rex let out a low, approving growl, its massive head tilting slightly as it watched the tiny creature move. The baby chirped softly, its confidence growing as it took another step. Its small legs still trembled, and the mud clinging to its scales made each movement awkward and slow, but it was moving. The T-Rex stepped back again, its massive frame looming like a guardian as it guided the baby away from the muddy trap. Its golden eyes flicked constantly between the baby and the surrounding forest, as though watching for any sign of danger. The baby continued to move, its tiny claws digging into the ground as it followed the T-Rex's subtle cues. It didn't know where it was going, didn't know why it was following the predator, but something deep inside told it to trust the towering creature. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the baby reached solid ground. Its small body collapsed onto the dry earth, its chest heaving as it struggled to catch its breath. The T-Rex rumbled softly, lowering its massive head until it was level with the baby. It sniffed the tiny creature carefully, its golden eyes scanning the baby for any signs of injury. The baby let out a faint chirp, its yellow eyes half closed as exhaustion threatened to overtake it. The T-Rex nudged the baby gently, its massive snout pushing the tiny creature upright. The baby blinked, its small legs trembling as it struggled to stand. It let out a soft chirp, its head tilting slightly as it looked up at the predator. The T-Rex rumbled again, its golden eyes narrowing slightly. It glanced toward the forest, then back at the baby, as though urging the tiny creature to move. The baby hesitated, its yellow eyes flicking toward the dense trees. The jungle was vast and dangerous, filled with predators far less forgiving than the T-Rex. But it didn't feel alone anymore. The T-Rex took a step forward, its massive frame moving with surprising grace as it began to walk toward the forest. It paused, glancing back at the baby with a low rumble, as though waiting for it to follow. The baby chirped softly, its tiny legs wobbling as it stood. It took a hesitant step forward, then another, its small claws digging into the dry earth. The T-Rex waited patiently, its golden eyes calm as it watched the baby approach. For the first time in its short life, the baby felt a strange sense of safety. The jungle was still dangerous, still filled with countless threats, but the T-Rex's presence was a shield against that danger. Slowly, the baby began to follow. The jungle stretched endlessly around them, its thick foliage casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. The baby moved cautiously, its small body weaving through the underbrush as it trailed behind the T-Rex. The massive predator moved with purpose, its golden eyes scanning the forest with a sharp intensity. Every now and then, It would pause, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air, searching for any sign of danger. The baby watched the T-Rex closely, its yellow eyes wide with a mixture of awe and curiosity. It still didn't understand why the predator was helping it, but it didn't question it. The T-Rex paused again, its massive frame still as it listened to the sounds of the jungle. Its golden eyes narrowed slightly, and it let out a low growl that vibrated through the air like a warning. The baby froze, its tiny body trembling as it stared up at the predator. It didn't know what the growl meant, but it could feel the tension in the air. The T-Rex turned its massive head, its golden eyes locking onto the baby. It let out another soft rumble, nudging the tiny creature forward with its snout. The baby chirped faintly, its small legs wobbling as it stumbled forward. It didn't know what the T-Rex was leading it toward, but it trusted the predator's guidance. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the sounds of the forest grew louder. The distant roars of other predators echoed through the trees, mingling with the rustle of leaves and the faint buzz of insects. The baby stayed close to the T-Rex, its small body moving in the massive predator's shadow. It still felt the weight of exhaustion, the lingering ache of hunger, but it kept moving. The T-Rex paused again, its massive frame still as it sniffed the air. Its golden eyes flicked toward a cluster of dense bushes, and it let out a low growl. The baby froze, its yellow eyes wide as it stared at the predator. It didn't understand what the growl meant, but it could feel the tension in the air. The T-Rex moved cautiously, its massive claws sinking into the earth with each step. It sniffed the air again, its golden eyes narrowing as it approached the bushes. The baby watched, its tiny body trembling as it waited. The T-Rex reached the bushes, its massive head lowering as it sniffed the ground. It let out a soft huff, its golden eyes flicking toward the baby. Then, with a single powerful motion, the T-Rex used its massive claws to tear away the bushes, revealing what lay hidden beneath. The baby let out a startled chirp, its yellow eyes widening as it saw what the T-Rex had uncovered. A nest. The nest was nestled in a hollow beneath the bushes, its walls made of twigs and leaves. Inside, there were several small eggs, their shells a pale green that glinted faintly in the dappled sunlight. The baby chirped again, its tiny head tilting as it stared at the nest. The T-Rex rumbled softly, its massive head lowering as it nudged one of the eggs with its snout. Its golden eyes flicked toward the baby, as though encouraging it to approach. The baby hesitated, its small legs trembling as it took a cautious step forward. The T-Rex watched patiently, its golden eyes calm as it waited. Finally, the baby reached the nest, its tiny claws brushing against the edge of the twigs. It let out a soft chirp, its yellow eyes flicking up to the T-Rex. The massive predator rumbled softly, its golden eyes narrowing slightly. The jungle around them was vast and dangerous, but in this small, hidden corner of the forest, there was safety. And for the first time, the baby understood what it meant to belong. The baby Velociraptor stared at the nest, its tiny claws resting on the edge of the carefully woven twigs. The eggs inside glistened faintly in the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. The baby chirped softly, its yellow eyes flicking up to the T-Rex as if seeking permission. The massive predator stood nearby, its golden eyes watching the baby with an intensity that was both protective and curious. It let out a low rumble, the sound deep and resonant, as though encouraging the tiny creature to step closer. The baby hesitated, its small body trembling slightly as it took another cautious step toward the nest. Its movements were slow, careful, as though it feared the fragile eggs might shatter at the slightest touch. The T-Rex lowered its massive head, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed at the nest. The predator's presence should have been terrifying, but the baby felt no fear. Instead, there was a strange sense of calm, a quiet understanding that this towering creature meant no harm. The baby chirped again, its voice soft and hesitant. It glanced back at the T-Rex, its yellow eyes wide and questioning. The T-Rex responded with another soft rumble, its massive frame shifting slightly as it leaned closer to the nest. It nudged one of the eggs gently with its snout, the motion impossibly delicate for a creature of its size. The baby watched, its small body trembling with a mixture of awe and confusion. It didn't understand why the T-Rex was acting this way, didn't know what the predator wanted. But something about the gentle movements, the soft sounds, made the baby feel safe. The jungle around them was still alive with noise, the distant roars of predators, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. But in this small clearing, there was a strange sense of peace. The baby reached out with one tiny claw, tapping lightly against the shell of one of the eggs. The surface was smooth and cool beneath its touch, and the baby tilted its head, chirping softly as it examined the fragile object. The T-Rex watched silently, its golden eyes flicking between the baby and the nest. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then, the ground beneath them shook. The baby let out a startled chirp, its tiny body stumbling backward as the earth trembled. The T-Rex lifted its massive head, its golden eyes narrowing as it scanned the surrounding forest. The vibrations grew stronger, each one accompanied by a deep, rhythmic thud that echoed through the trees. The sound was faint at first, like distant thunder, but it grew louder with each passing second. The T-Rex let out a low growl, its massive frame tensing as it turned toward the source of the sound. Its golden eyes glinted with a sharp intensity, and its nostrils flared as it sniffed the air. The baby whimpered softly, its tiny body pressing against the ground as it stared up at the towering predator. It didn't know what was happening, but instinct told it to be afraid. The thudding grew louder, closer, until the jungle seemed to vibrate with the force of the approaching footsteps. The T-Rex stepped in front of the nest, its massive frame shielding the fragile eggs and the tiny Velociraptor behind it. The baby chirped faintly, its yellow eyes wide with fear as it huddled against the ground. And then, through the dense foliage, a new predator emerged. The Allosaurus was smaller than the T-Rex, but no less fearsome. Its sleek, muscular body moved with a predator's grace, its sharp claws gleaming in the dappled sunlight. Its eyes were cold and calculating, scanning the clearing with a hunger that sent a chill through the air. The T-Rex let out a thunderous roar, the sound echoing through the jungle like a storm. Its massive frame loomed over the clearing, every muscle tense as it prepared to defend its territory. The Allosaurus paused, its golden eyes narrowing as it assessed the situation. It was outmatched, outclassed, but hunger made it bold. The baby whimpered softly, its tiny body trembling as it pressed itself against the ground. The T-Rex glanced back briefly, its golden eyes locking onto the baby. It let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that was both a warning and a reassurance. Then, without hesitation, the T-Rex charged. The ground shook beneath its massive frame as it barreled toward the Allosaurus, its roar splitting the air like a thunderclap. The smaller predator snarled in response, its claws slicing through the air as it lunged to meet the attack. The two predators collided with a force that sent shockwaves through the clearing. The T-Rex's massive jaws snapped shut, narrowly missing the Allosaurus's neck as the smaller predator twisted away. The Allosaurus struck back, its sharp claws raking across the T-Rex's side. The larger predator let out a roar of pain, but it didn't falter. It turned sharply, its massive tail whipping through the air and striking the Allosaurus with bone-crushing force. The smaller predator stumbled, its legs buckling beneath it as it let out a guttural snarl. The T-Rex didn't give it a chance to recover. It lunged forward, its massive jaws closing around the Allosaurus's neck. With a powerful shake, it threw the smaller predator to the ground, the impact sending a cloud of dust and leaves into the air. The baby watched in stunned silence, its tiny body trembling as the battle unfolded before it. The T-Rex stepped back, its golden eyes locked onto the Allosaurus as it let out another thunderous roar. The smaller predator scrambled to its feet, its sleek body trembling with a mixture of pain and fear. For a moment, the two predators stared at each other, the air between them crackling with tension. Then, with a final snarl, the Allosaurus turned and fled, its sleek frame disappearing into the dense jungle. The T-Rex stood still, its massive chest heaving as it watched the smaller predator vanish into the trees. Its golden eyes flicked toward the nest, scanning the fragile eggs and the tiny Velociraptor huddled nearby. The baby chirped softly, its yellow eyes wide with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The T-Rex let out a low rumble, its massive frame relaxing slightly as it stepped back toward the nest. Its golden eyes softened as it glanced down at the baby, as though checking to make sure it was unharmed. The baby chirped again, its tiny claws pressing against the ground as it stared up at the towering predator. For the first time, the baby felt something it had never known before. Felt safe. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the jungle, the baby curled up near the base of the nest. Its tiny body trembled with exhaustion, but its yellow eyes remained locked on the T-Rex. The massive predator stood nearby, its golden eyes scanning the surrounding forest with a quiet intensity. It was a sentinel, a guardian, and its presence filled the clearing with a strange, unspoken sense of peace. The baby let out a soft chirp, its tiny claws curling against the ground as sleep began to pull at it. The T-Rex glanced down, its massive head lowering slightly as it let out a low, soothing rumble. The sound vibrated through the air like a lullaby, and the baby's yellow eyes drooped, its breathing growing slow and steady. The jungle was still dangerous, still filled with countless threats, but here in this small clearing, the baby knew it was safe. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, the bond between the two unlikely creatures grew stronger. A bond forged not by blood, but by trust. The baby Velociraptor awoke to the soft hum of the jungle at dawn. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and foliage, the sky painted with streaks of orange and gold as sunlight pierced through the canopy. For a moment, the baby lay still, its tiny body curled against the base of the nest, the events of the previous day lingering in its mind like a fading dream. But then it looked up and saw the T-Rex. The massive predator stood a few feet away, its golden eyes scanning the dense jungle with a sharp, watchful gaze. Its scarred body was still and tense, every muscle ready to spring into action at the first sign of danger. The baby chirped softly, its yellow eyes wide as it watched the towering figure. The T-Rex turned its head slightly, its gaze shifting toward the tiny creature. For a brief moment, their eyes met, predator and prey, connected by something far deeper than instinct. The T-Rex let out a low rumble, the sound vibrating through the air like a reassurance. The baby blinked, its tiny claws gripping the ground as it slowly rose to its feet. It felt stronger now, its exhaustion from the previous day replaced by a cautious energy. The mud that had clung to its scales had dried and cracked, leaving faint traces that told the story of its struggle. The T-Rex stepped closer, its massive frame moving with surprising grace. It lowered its head, sniffing the air around the baby with a curiosity that was almost parental. The baby chirped again, its voice soft and questioning. It didn't understand why the predator had saved it, why it continued to protect it, but the fear it had once felt was gone. Instead, there was something new, something that felt like trust. The T-Rex let out another soft rumble, its massive snout nudging the baby gently. The tiny creature stumbled slightly but quickly regained its footing, its yellow eyes glinting with determination. The baby looked up at the T-Rex, its head tilting slightly as though trying to read the predator's intentions. The T-Rex rumbled again, turning its head toward the jungle and letting out a low growl. It was time to move. The baby hesitated for a moment, its tiny claws pressing against the ground as it glanced back at the nest. The eggs inside were untouched, their pale green shells glinting faintly in the morning light. But the T-Rex was already stepping forward, its massive frame disappearing into the dense foliage. The baby chirped softly, then hurried after it. The jungle was alive with sound as the pair moved through the underbrush. Birds called out from the treetops, their voices sharp and melodic, while the distant roars of predators echoed faintly in the background. The ground beneath their feet was soft and uneven, a tangle of roots and leaves that made each step a challenge. The T-Rex moved with purpose, its massive frame cutting through the dense vegetation like a force of nature. Its golden eyes flicked constantly between the path ahead and the surrounding trees, its sharp senses on high alert. The baby followed close behind, its small legs working hard to keep up with the predator's long strides. It stumbled occasionally, its tiny claws catching on roots or slipping against damp leaves, but it always managed to recover. The T-Rex paused occasionally, its massive head tilting as it sniffed the air. It let out low rumbles, the sounds vibrating through the jungle like a warning to any predators that might be nearby. The baby watched the T-Rex closely, mimicking its movements as best it could. It sniffed the air when the predator did, its tiny nose twitching as it tried to catch the same scents. For hours, they moved through the jungle, the dense foliage around them growing thicker with each step. The baby's tiny body trembled with effort, its legs growing tired as the journey stretched on. But it didn't stop. Couldn't. The T-Rex glanced back occasionally, its golden eyes narrowing as it watched the baby struggle. It let out soft rumbles, urging the tiny creature to keep moving. Finally, as the sun reached its highest point in the sky, they emerged into a small clearing. The clearing was surrounded by towering trees, their thick branches casting dappled shadows across the ground. In the center, a small stream wound its way through the earth, its clear water glinting in the sunlight. The baby chirped softly, its yellow eyes wide as it stared at the water. It had been so long since it had seen anything so clean, so fresh. The T-Rex let out a low rumble, its massive frame stepping aside to give the baby room. The tiny Velociraptor hesitated for a moment, its yellow eyes flicking up to the predator. When the T-Rex didn't move, the baby took a cautious step forward. Its small claws pressed against the soft earth as it approached the stream, the sound of running water filling its ears. It sniffed the air, its tiny nose catching the faint, cool scent of the water. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the baby lunged forward, its tiny snout dipping into the stream. The water was cool and refreshing, washing away the exhaustion that had weighed it down for so long. The baby drank deeply, its tiny body trembling with relief as the clean water filled its belly. The T-Rex watched silently, its massive frame still as it stood guard over the clearing. Its golden eyes flicked constantly between the baby and the surrounding jungle, its senses attuned to every sound, every movement. The baby lifted its head, droplets of water clinging to its tiny snout. It chirped softly, its yellow eyes flicking up to the T-Rex with a look of gratitude that was almost human. The T-Rex let out a low rumble, its massive head lowering slightly in response. For a moment, the clearing was quiet, the only sound the gentle rush of the stream. Then, the T-Rex turned its head sharply, its golden eyes narrowing as it stared into the dense foliage. The baby froze, its tiny body trembling as it followed the predator's gaze. The jungle was silent now, the sounds of birds and insects fading into an eerie stillness. The T-Rex let out a low growl, its massive frame tensing as it sniffed the air. Its golden eyes glinted with a sharp intensity, and its tail flicked behind it like a whip. The baby whimpered softly, its tiny claws pressing into the ground as fear surged through its small body. And then the silence was broken. A roar erupted from the jungle, deep and guttural, sending a shiver through the air. The ground trembled beneath their feet as heavy footsteps echoed through the trees. The T-Rex stepped in front of the baby, its massive frame shielding the tiny creature as it let out a thunderous roar. The baby whimpered again, its tiny body pressing against the ground as it stared up at the towering predator. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a massive shape emerged from the trees. It was another T-Rex. The new predator was massive, its dark scales glinting in the sunlight as it stepped into the clearing. Its golden eyes flicked toward the baby Velociraptor, then back to the T-Rex standing protectively in front of it. For a moment, the two predators stared at each other, the air between them crackling with tension. The baby whimpered softly, its yellow eyes darting between the two towering figures. The first T-Rex let out a low growl, its massive frame tense as it stood its ground. The second T-Rex tilted its head slightly, its golden eyes narrowing as it studied the baby. Then, with a rumbling snort, the second predator stepped back, its massive frame disappearing into the jungle. The baby let out a faint chirp, its tiny body trembling as the tension in the air began to fade. The T-Rex turned its head, its golden eyes softening as it glanced down at the baby. It let out a low rumble, its massive snout nudging the tiny creature gently. The baby chirped softly, its yellow eyes filled with gratitude. In the jungle, survival was a constant battle. But in that moment, beneath the towering trees and the endless sky, the baby knew it was safe. And for the first time, the T-Rex felt something more than instinct, a bond that couldn't be broken. The baby Velociraptor stayed close to the T-Rex as they left the clearing behind, the stream's soft babble fading into the distance. The encounter with the second T-Rex had left a tension lingering in the air, but it was already dissipating as the pair moved deeper into the jungle. The baby chirped softly, glancing up at the towering predator that had become its unlikely protector. It didn't understand why the T-Rex had stepped in to shield it, why it hadn't simply walked away or, worse, turned on it as any other predator would have. But the why didn't matter. All the baby knew was that it was alive, against all odds, and it was no longer alone. The T-Rex moved with deliberate steps, its massive frame parting the thick foliage with ease. Its golden eyes flicked back occasionally, checking on the baby as it stumbled along behind. The tiny creature was still weak, its legs trembling with exhaustion, but it pushed forward, determined not to fall behind. They reached a small rise in the jungle, the ground sloping upward toward a rocky outcrop. The T-Rex paused at the top, its head lifting as it sniffed the air. Its golden eyes scanned the horizon, taking in the vast expanse of jungle stretching out before them. The baby chirped faintly, struggling to climb the slope. Its tiny claws scrabbled against the loose dirt, slipping and sliding with each step. The T-Rex turned its massive head, watching silently as the baby struggled. Then, with a surprising gentleness, it lowered its snout, nudging the tiny creature upward. The baby let out a startled chirp, its small body pushed forward by the predator's careful touch. It stumbled onto the rocky ledge, collapsing in a heap as it caught its breath. The T-Rex let out a low rumble, stepping onto the ledge beside the baby. Its golden eyes flicked toward the horizon, its massive frame silhouetted against the golden light of the setting sun. For a moment, neither of them moved. The jungle stretched endlessly around them, a sea of green and gold that seemed to go on forever. The distant calls of birds echoed faintly through the air, mingling with the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The baby chirped softly, its tiny head tilting as it stared up at the T-Rex. The predator lowered its head, its golden eyes meeting the baby's gaze. It let out a low, rumbling sound, its breath warm and steady. The baby didn't flinch. It didn't run. Instead, it took a cautious step forward, pressing its tiny body against the T-Rex's massive foot. The predator didn't move. It stood still, its golden eyes soft as it watched the tiny creature seek comfort in its presence. For the first time, the baby felt something it had never known before. Felt safe. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next as the pair moved through the jungle. The baby grew stronger with each passing day, its tiny body filling out as it learned to hunt and forage. It still followed the T-Rex closely, mimicking its movements and relying on its protection, but it was becoming more independent. The T-Rex watched the baby's progress silently, its golden eyes sharp and calculating. It didn't intervene unless necessary, allowing the tiny creature to learn and grow on its own. But it was always there, a silent guardian that kept the jungle's many dangers at bay. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, forged in the crucible of survival. The baby no longer feared the T-Rex. It trusted the predator completely, following it without hesitation wherever it went. And the T-Rex, in turn, had come to see the baby as something more than just another creature in its territory. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, the pair reached another clearing. This one was larger, its center dominated by a shallow pool of water that reflected the fiery hues of the sunset. The baby chirped excitedly, rushing toward the pool with tiny, eager steps. The T-Rex watched silently, its massive frame still as it stood at the edge of the clearing. The baby reached the water's edge, its tiny claws pressing into the soft mud. It sniffed the air, its yellow eyes wide with curiosity as it dipped its snout into the cool, clear water. It drank deeply, the refreshing liquid soothing the thirst that had built up during their long journey. The T-Rex let out a low rumble, its golden eyes narrowing as it scanned the surrounding jungle. The baby looked up, its tiny head tilting as it followed the predator's gaze. The jungle was quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of life had faded, replaced by a heavy stillness that made the air feel thick and oppressive. The T-Rex stepped forward, its massive frame moving with deliberate caution. Its golden eyes flicked constantly between the trees, its sharp senses on high alert. The baby whimpered softly, its tiny body trembling as it pressed itself against the ground. And then, the silence was shattered. A deafening roar erupted from the jungle, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The baby let out a startled chirp, its tiny body frozen with fear. The T-Rex roared in response, the sound echoing through the clearing like a thunderclap. Its massive frame tensed, every muscle coiled and ready for the inevitable fight. Through the dense foliage, a massive shape emerged. It was a Carnotaurus, its sleek, muscular body moving with a predator's grace. Its small, sharp eyes locked onto the baby Velociraptor, its massive jaws parting in a hungry snarl. The T-Rex stepped in front of the baby, its golden eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. It let out another thunderous roar, the sound vibrating through the air like a challenge. The Carnotaurus didn't back down. It snarled in response, its sharp claws slicing through the dirt as it prepared to attack. The baby whimpered softly, its tiny body pressing against the ground as it watched the two predators face off. The T-Rex lunged forward, its massive jaws snapping shut inches from the Carnotaurus's neck. The smaller predator twisted away, its sleek body moving with surprising speed. The Carnotaurus struck back, its sharp claws raking across the T-Rex's side. The larger predator roared in pain, but it didn't falter. It turned sharply, its massive tail whipping through the air and striking the Carnotaurus with a bone-crushing force. The Carnotaurus stumbled, its legs buckling beneath it as it let out a guttural snarl. The T-Rex didn't give it a chance to recover. It lunged forward, its massive jaws closing around the Carnotaurus's neck. With a powerful shake, it threw the smaller predator to the ground, the impact sending a cloud of dust and leaves into the air. The baby watched in stunned silence, its tiny body trembling as the battle unfolded before it. The Carnotaurus scrambled to its feet, its sleek body trembling with a mixture of pain and fear. For a moment, the two predators stared at each other, the air between them crackling with tension. Then, with a final snarl, the Carnotaurus turned and fled, its sleek frame disappearing into the dense jungle. The T-Rex stood still, its massive chest heaving as it watched the smaller predator vanish into the trees. The baby let out a faint chirp, its yellow eyes filled with awe and gratitude. The T-Rex turned its head, its golden eyes softening as it glanced down at the baby. It let out a low rumble, its massive snout nudging the tiny creature gently. The baby chirped softly, its tiny claws pressing into the ground as it stared up at the towering predator. For the first time, the baby felt a strange sense of belonging. In the vast, dangerous jungle, they were an unlikely pair, predator and prey, united by a bond that defied nature itself. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson, the baby knew one thing for certain. It was no longer alone.